If you were here with us last week, you know that Father Stephen Barella was here. But I want you to do maybe the impossible and try to think of 2 weeks ago, where I mentioned that we're going to be looking at 6 consecutive weeks spending time in our first reading in the Acts of the Apostles. And the Acts of the Apostles, as we mentioned, it gives an insight of the early church. And we looked at 2 weeks ago on where it is that we find ourselves today, here in the 21st century. And we saw that where we find ourselves today is in a post-Christian era, an era which now no longer kind of sees things through a Christian worldview or a biblical worldview. And what that's done, it's done nothing but lead us to a mental health crisis, anxiousness, and directionlessness. And I mentioned, if you remember 2 weeks ago, that it makes an opportunity. I said how I'm excited for the next 10 years as I think we're going to continue to see a further degeneration, but also see a increase of return to the church, an increase to newfound faith. Someone pointed out to me this week of a recent Barna Group study that showed how Gen Z shows increasingly signs that they're spiritually open. Right? You can look at that study and look at the indicators and why they say that. It certainly, what includes in that is how Gen Z is increased in witchcraft. You know, like it's gone up, I think 257% in Gen Z of people of Gen Z interested in witchcraft. But even that, I look at that and I think that's encouraging. They're like, Father Mark, how could our Gen Z being in witchcraft, how can that be encouraging? But it shows an increased openness, curiosity of saying that there's, for really the first generation, that's Gen Z is now the youngest generation who are now adults, the oldest of Gen Z, and it's really the first generation who's grown up in households that are essentially, as Pope Benedict called, practical atheists, or just non-religious, not going to church. And they've come to age now with not going to church, a void of God, and at the spot of there's gotta be something else. They're curious to an answer to the brokenness in which they see. And so, eventually witchcraft is a dead end because the human soul was created for God. But we have incredible opportunity. You could say it another way and say we have incredible opportunity to bear fruit. And we hear in our gospel today that the Father wants us to bear fruit. He expects us as his disciples to bear fruit. Not only that, but we want to bear fruit. When I even think about myself in this church, right? And I want this church to grow. I want us to be a church that increasingly has a whole bunch of stories like William, who was baptized and a parishioners met up at work, invited him over to his family home, and they talked, and a year later he's getting baptized. I want us to be a church that continually grows and make disciples. And I spend so much time thinking and strategizing, and to be honest, worrying a lot. Worrying a lot about you. And for you, and for your kids. I got a whole homily coming up just on worry, okay? Because I know I'm not supposed to worry as much as I do. I think different people are prone to worry more than others. I worry a lot. Just how, it's not good, but I worry a lot. So yes, certainly the church wanted to bear fruit, but of course you want to bear fruit too. You want to bear, the church sees the family as what? The domestic church. It's like parents over and over again, or grandparents. God, you want your children to be happy. It's another way to say that is I want them to be fruitful. I want them to bear fruit. And you spend a lot of time strategizing and thinking and putting things in place and trying to make things perfect for my kids. Do this and do that so that they're happy, that they bear fruit. And time thinking and strategizing is important. But we have to listen to what Jesus says and what he tells us to do if we want to bear fruit that lasts. Verse 4, Jesus says, remain in me as I remain in you. Just as a branch cannot bear fruit on its own unless it remains on the vine, so neither can you unless you remain in me. I brought a branch. I don't know if this comes from an apple tree or not. Like, I grabbed it on a run yesterday on Chicago Avenue when I was with the Fit Shepherds, all right? If you live on Chicago Avenue and you're looking at this, you're like, hey, I think that looks familiar. That might come from my tree. I'm sorry. But do you think if all of us, even we work together, if all of us, we tried and we worked together really hard, you think we could make this bear fruit? I see a couple of you shaking your head, yes. Like, no. Like, we could maybe tape some grapes on here or something and have them hang off, or like tape an apple to it and like have it look like it bared some fruit. But this thing can try, like bared some fruit. It can try as hard as it wants. It's got no chance. This thing's not bearing fruit because it's not connected to the vine. And Jesus is like, it's almost as if he's with his disciples and he's looking at a branch lying on the floor that's not connected to the vine. And he's saying, like, don't you get it? You're being ridiculous if you're not connected to him. If you're not connected to me, if you're not connected to the vine, it's got no chance to bear fruit. We can read all the self-help books that we can get our hands on, right? And how to be happy, and even like what the psychologists are saying to live a happy, flourishing life. I can read all the productivity books, like to make more time, and leadership books for this church and to grow disciples. And parents can read like all the new books and like the strategies and what should parents be having their kids do more of and less of, so that my kids can be happy and bear fruit. He's saying you can do all those things, but if you're not abiding in me, you're not going to bear fruit that lasts. The next verse, verse 5. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever remains in me and I in him will bear much fruit. There's the guarantee. It's very clear. Fruit, lasting fruit, comes from loving God deeply and remaining in him. Or as other translations say, abiding in him, which is really better translation, because abiding means to be in a fixed state, to dwell, to be rooted in a spot. And so a phrase that's been repeating in my head, I know the Lord's been telling me this personally this past week, but the more that I heard this phrase this past week and the last 2 weeks, is the more like the Lord saying, like Mark, your people need to hear it. The same phrase that he was telling me. And it's this: don't try so hard. Like listen to me. Some of you need to really look at me here. You're trying too hard. And you know me long enough by now, 2.5 years, to know that I'm not this willy-nilly hippie and just like, let anything go. Like, just everything will work out. You don't need to do anything. You know that's not me. But I think the Lord wants you to hear, and me to hear, you're trying too hard. Like, some of you are killing yourselves with trying to make things perfect for your kids. To do this and to do that, I just want this thing to bear fruit. Whatever this is in your life here this morning, like, I just want this to bear fruit. I want to make it bear fruit. I do the same thing. It's my struggle. The irony is, the more we do this, trying to make it bear fruit, the more tendency that we have to slip out of communion. The trying to bear fruit, like, do you think You think this branch, even if it's connected to the vine, is saying like, I gotta produce fruit. It's just because it's connected to the vine. The Lord's just saying, don't try so hard. And what does he do? He points us to communion with him. He points us to be in union with him, to remain in him, to abide in him, to soak up in times of prayer, this deep communion and intimacy with the Lord. And like this whole analogy that the Lord gives here in John 15, it's so, like it's easy. Not to do it is easy. Like it's simple though. It's simple. To do it's not easy. And I think oftentimes we don't look through these simple lenses that the scriptures give us, that Christ gives us, to question on what is happening in our life. To use the simple lenses in which the Lord gives us, to use it to ask and question what's happening in our lives, like, how am I doing as a human being? Am I thriving? Right? We can bring in what the Lord says later through Paul in Galatians 5. He talks about the fruits of the Holy Spirit: love, joy, peace, generosity, faithfulness, self-control, gentleness. Is my soul experiencing these things? You can look at it in a general way, but you can also use it to get really specific. Are these things, love, joy, patience, self-control, gentleness, are they present in my relationship? Is it present in my marriage? Is it present in how I deal with my siblings? How I deal with my parents? Is it present at work? And the invitation, what we'll find, is always the Lord just pointing us back to himself. What am I trying so hard to make work? And the Lord is saying, you know, it's more simple than that. Remain in me. Abide in me. Maybe just one last move here to close. It's really going back to the first verse. This was verse 4 and verse 5. Go back to the very first verse, and Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, what? I am the true vine. Note that he doesn't just say, I'm the vine. Note that he says, I'm the true vine. And so the Jews there are hearing that. It goes right over our head, but they know exactly what he's saying. They're like, what? What do you mean you're the true vine? Because over and over again in the Old Testament, the Israelites, God's people, were described as the vine. And every time it was brought up in the Old Testament of the Israel, God's people being the vine, it was always in a negative way, eventually. There was always an announcement that judgment was coming. Because they were a people who were appointed, they were God's people, they were appointed to bear fruit, but they were corrupt. And see, they could never produce the fruit that God wanted them to produce. And so they were just stuck in this cycle, the Israelites. And so Jesus comes and he turns that on its head now. God takes on flesh and he comes and turns that on its head and says, I'm the true vine. I've come to enter into the banner of brokenness. I've come to enter into the patterns of failure. I've come to enter into sin and to do for you what you weren't able to do for yourself. I've took on flesh to go and to do for you what you couldn't do for yourself, to struggle and overcome in sin or whatever it is that I'm struggling with. Don't you see, you got to be attached to me. I'm the true vine. I'm for you what you couldn't do for yourself. I'm being what you were not able to be. The Lord expects us to produce fruit. Doesn't matter our state in life. Here this morning, he expects us as his disciples to produce fruit. And if we're going to be a church that grows disciples and evangelizes and bring people from outside who are lost and are looking for answers due to the brokenness. If we're going to be a church that bears fruit, if we're going to be domestic churches, households, marriages, and families that produce fruit, we have got to stay connected to the vine and abide in him.